The team tumbled onto the scorching desert sand in an ungraceful heap. Clayton groaned, brushing grit from his face, while Dr. Lowe sat up, shaking his head. The searing heat hit them first. Clayton squinted against the blazing sun, a vast expanse of desert stretching endlessly in every direction. Sand shifted underfoot. The golden dunes shimmered like molten waves. He rolled onto his side, coughing out grit and checking himself over. Miraculously, everything seemed intact. "Seriously, again," Dr. Lowe muttered, glaring at the barren landscape as he rubbed his shoulder. "Why do these portals always treat me like a rag doll?" Clayton pushed himself up, checking his limbs with a wince. "At least no broken bones this time. That's progress, right?" Dr. Lowe shot him a deadpan look. "Sure, let's celebrate. Next time, maybe I'll just bounce." "Is it too much to ask to be dropped into a nice, air-conditioned lab?" "Guess we're not that lucky," Jenkins grumbled, already scanning their surroundings with a hand on his holstered weapon. His sharp eyes darted to movement, but it was only a lizard skittering across the sand. Dr. Harris knelt beside her equipment pack, her face flushed with heat but calm. "We should figure out where we are before hydration becomes an issue." "Good idea," Clayton said, helping her up. "Dr. Thomas, anything useful on that GPS?" Dr. Thomas, dusting sand from his sleeves, tapped a few buttons on the portable unit. He frowned. "It's functioning, but signal strength is weak. I can get us a general heading. Looks like there's a settlement about 20 kilometers southeast." "Of course, it's far," Jenkins muttered, slinging his pack over his shoulder. As they gathered their gear, Dr. Lowe's face twisted with disgust. Clayton? What's that?" Clayton turned confused. "What's what?" Dr. Lowe pointed at the back of Clayton's jacket. "Don't move." "What are you—" Clayton froze as Dr. Lowe reached out cautiously, yanking something free from his coat. The team recoiled as Dr. Lowe held up a severed, fur-covered hand. Its feline claws curled grotesquely, the spotted hair flecked with blood. "Looks like our friend from the last place left a parting gift." Dr. Thomas leaned in, his scientific curiosity outweighing his revulsion. "It's still twitching. Fascinating. The cellular structure must—" "Not the time, Doc," Jenkins interrupted, tossing the claw into the sand. "Focus," Clayton ordered, his voice steady. "Let's move before we attract any unwanted attention." Log update, day 1. Or is it 2? Honestly, I've lost track of time since falling through that portal. We've landed in what looks like a desert. Hot, dry, and unforgiving. The gate isn't exactly known for its precision. Got an unwelcome souvenir from the last mission. A severed jaguar-like hand still clamped to the back of my jacket. Guess our gang leader friend wasn't ready to let go, even after death. Dr. Thomas says it's biologically fascinating. Jenkins says it's disgusting. I'm inclined to agree with both. We're already off to a rocky start. Dr. Lowe is less than thrilled about being dropped out of the sky again. No broken bones this time, though, so that's progress. Still, we're stranded. The frequency belt is fried, and there's no telling what's lurking out there. First order of business, find shelter, water, and maybe someone who can help us fix this belt. Here's hoping we don't run into anything worse than scorpions. The trek across the dunes was grueling. The sun bore down relentlessly, and every step seemed to sink them deeper into the sand. Hours later, their water supply dwindled. A small house finally came into view on the horizon. The structure was modest, its adobe walls weathered but sturdy. A chicken coop and a rusted pickup truck sat out front. Signs of life, both hopeful and precarious. "Let me do the talking," Clayton said, stepping ahead as they approached the house. A man in his mid-30s emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes narrowed at the strangers, but his stance wasn't hostile. Yet. Hello there, Clayton said, raising a hand in greeting. We mean no harm. Our vehicle broke down a few kilometers back. The man's gaze shifted between them before he spoke. The desert's no place to get lost. Come inside. We have water, he said in Spanish. Huh. We're in Mexico, Dr. Thomas commented as relief washed over the team. They followed the man into the cool interior. The room was sparsely furnished, but welcoming, with mismatched chairs and a table laden with fresh tortillas and beans. The man introduced himself as Eduardo, and his wife brought water and food. Clayton noticed a little boy peeking from behind her skirt, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. Gracias, Dr. Thomas said, his Venezuelan accent softening the words as he sipped gratefully. As they ate, Eduardo's brow furrowed. Why are you here? It's not safe, he said as Dr. Thomas translated. We're just passing through, Clayton replied. But Eduardo shook his head. No one just passes through. Not with the cartels controlling everything, he said in English. A tense silence fell over the table. The weight of Eduardo's words was clear. The desert wasn't their only threat, and cartels, no matter the world, aren't known for mercy. The house was small but inviting, a beacon of warmth against the desolation of the desert. Eduardo led the group inside, his every move cautious. He glanced out the window before shutting the door behind them, his hand lingering on the lock for a moment too long. Clayton stood near the doorway, shaking sand from his jacket as the team also dusted themselves off. Eduardo spoke quickly, his tone a mix of nervousness and hospitality. Please make yourself comfortable, he said in Spanish, gesturing toward a bench with faded cushions. Dr. Thomas translated again, adding, He's asking us to sit. The group settled into the small living area while Eduardo disappeared into the back room. His wife busied herself in the kitchen, casting uncertain glances at the strangers. Her hands worked quickly, chopping vegetables and heating water on an old stove. She spoke softly, her words meant for Eduardo's ears but loud enough for the group to hear. Who are they? And why are they here? She's asking if we're soldiers, Dr. Thomas translated after a beat. No, Clayton replied firmly, raising his hands in mock surrender. We're just travelers. Before anyone could elaborate, Eduardo returned, holding the hand of a small boy, the child's golden eyes shimmering faintly in the dim room, and jaguar-like patterns marked his forearms and neck. His movements were precise and smooth, an unsettling contrast to what should have been the clumsiness of a sick child. This is my son, Mateo, Eduardo said, his voice tinged with pride and worry. Dr. Thomas crouched slightly, meeting the boy's eyes. His arms, those patterns, he murmured in Spanish, gesturing toward the boy's skin. Eduardo hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper as he replied in English. The serum did this. It saved him. Dr. Thomas straightened, his expression serious, as Eduardo explained in Spanish. Eduardo says he took the serum from a cartel lab. His son was too weak to walk before. The serum fixed that, but it changed him. Changed him how? Dr. Harris asked, her clinical curiosity breaking through her usual reserve. Eduardo's words tumbled out, fast and emotional. It healed his body and cured his, muscular dystrophy. His muscles, his bones, even his energy. It all came back. But now, he's different. Stronger. His senses are sharper. Too sharp. The boy shifted uncomfortably under the team's scrutiny, his gaze darting to the window. He froze for a moment. His nostrils flared slightly, as though catching a faint scent on the wind. What kind of side effects? Eduardo glanced at his son, and then back at the group, reluctant to speak. Finally, he muttered, "He's faster, stronger, but sometimes he's not himself. He acts more like an animal." Before anyone could respond, the hum of an approaching vehicle broke the tense silence. Eduardo's face drained of color as he darted to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek through. "They found us," he whispered in Spanish, his voice trembling. "What's he saying?" Clayton demanded, already rising to his feet. Dr. Thomas's voice was grim. "He says it's the cartel. They're here." Eduardo's whisper sent a chill through the room. The low rumble of an engine grew louder, punctuated by the crunch of tires on loose gravel. Clayton was already at the window, shifting the curtain just enough to see. Black SUV, tinted windows. "Definitely not friendly," he muttered, stepping back. Eduardo turned to his wife, speaking quickly in Spanish. "She's taking the boy to safety," Dr. Thomas translated before Eduardo could explain. The woman hesitated, her hands trembling as she gripped her son's shoulders. Mateo looked up at her, confused but obedient. Without a word, she led him through a narrow hallway, the door clicking softly shut behind them. "We need a plan," Dr. Harris said, her voice sharp. "We don't know how many there are and what they want." "They want the serum," Eduardo said in English, his meaning clear. "They know I took it." Clayton glanced at the others, then back at Eduardo. "How long do we have?" Eduardo's gaze flicked to the door, his voice barely audible. "Not long. They always send a warning first." As if on cue, a sharp knock echoed through the house. It was deliberate, heavy, and unyielding, a sound that demanded obedience. Clayton motioned for the group to stay quiet as he moved toward the door. Eduardo grabbed his arm, shaking his head. "No, let me." "Are you sure?" Clayton asked. Eduardo nodded, his jaw set. "If they see you, it will be worse." Reluctantly, Clayton stepped aside, letting Eduardo take the lead. The man took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. When he opened the door, 2 men stood on the porch, but were dressed in black, their faces hard and unreadable. One of them spoke, his tone cold and measured. "We know you're hiding something, Eduardo. The boss doesn't like being stolen from." Eduardo replied in rapid Spanish, his voice calm but strained. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man smirked, stepping closer. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what we're talking about. The serum. Hand it over, and maybe we'll forget this little betrayal." Dr. Thomas, standing just out of sight, whispered to the team. "He's telling them he doesn't have it anymore." Clayton frowned. "What do they want? The whole family?" "Possibly worse," Dr. Thomas said grimly. The second man, taller and broader, shoved Eduardo back a step, his voice rising. "You have one chance to make this right. Don't waste it." From the hallway, a faint sound carried through the tension. Mateo's voice. It was a soft, curious hum. Too quiet for the men at the door, but loud enough for Eduardo's panic to spike. "Keep him quiet," Dr. Thomas whispered urgently, gesturing toward the back room. Eduardo stood firm, his voice resolute. "You'll have no proof. Leave us alone." The smirk on the first man's face turned into a sneer. "We'll see about that." He turned to his partner, muttered something in quick Spanish. "They're planning to search the house," Dr. Thomas translated grimly. Clayton's hand drifted to the holster at his side. "Not happening," he said quietly. The air crackled with tension, the cartel members growing more impatient as Eduardo stalled. Clayton's eyes flickered towards Jenkins, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Jenkins, Clayton whispered, keeping his voice low. "Use your skills. Take charge." Jenkins didn't hesitate. Years of Special Forces training clicked into place, his mind already mapping the room, calculating angles, and assigning roles. "Dr. Harris, stay close to the family. Quietly guide them toward the back, out of sight. Dr. Lowe, keep an eye on the belt and be ready to move if this goes south," Jenkins instructed, his voice a calm command. "Clayton, you're our distraction. Hold their attention, but don't provoke." "And me?" Dr. Thomas whispered. "You're my backup. Stay sharp and follow my lead," Jenkins replied. The team moved into position with quiet efficiency. Eduardo's voice quivered as he continued to address the cartel in Spanish, buying precious seconds. His son clung to his mother, eyes wide with fear. Clayton stepped forward, his hands visible but commanding, his tone measured. "Gentlemen," he said in a deep, steady voice, "we're just passing through. No trouble here." The cartel leader sneered, his hand twitching towards his pistol. "Who said you could talk?" he growled, his gaze narrowing on Clayton. While their attention shifted to Clayton, Jenkins moved like a shadow, using the cluttered room to his advantage. He signaled to Dr. Thomas, pointing to the cartel member nearest the hallway. Dr. Thomas nodded and crept into position, ready to act. Jenkins reached the first man, a stocky figure holding a shotgun. With practiced precision, Jenkins disarmed him in a fluid motion, the weapon clattering to the ground as the man dropped silently with a well-placed strike. "One down," Jenkins muttered under his breath, signaling Dr. Thomas to cover him. Clayton kept talking, his voice firm yet nonchalant. "We're here for peaceful reasons. Let's not complicate things." Dr. Harris ushered Eduardo's wife and his son into the shadows, her movements deliberate and quiet. Mateo's frightened gaze locked on hers, and she gave him a reassuring nod. Jenkins moved with precision, signaling to Dr. Thomas to flank the man nearest the hallway. He gestured to Clayton with 2 fingers, indicating a distraction was needed. Clayton complied, raising his voice slightly. "So, what's the big deal? We're not exactly your usual targets. What do you want from us?" The leader scowled, turning his attention back to Clayton. "Shut your mouth before I shut it for you." Jenkins slipped behind the first cartel member, a wiry man with a pistol tucked in his waistband. With a practiced move, he pressed the pressure point at the base of the man's neck, catching him as he slumped to the ground. Silently, Jenkins removed the pistol, ejecting the magazine and tossing the parts under a pile of debris. He signaled Dr. Thomas, who crept toward another man leaning against a stack of crates. Dr. Thomas grabbed a nearby broom handle, using it to sweep the man's legs out from underneath him. Before the cartel member could cry out, Dr. Thomas clamped a hand over his mouth, and Jenkins stepped in to finish the takedown with a precise strike to the temple. Meanwhile, Dr. Harris had quietly slipped out the back, unnoticed in the commotion. She crouched low near the cartel's truck, her hand clutching a screwdriver she'd found earlier. Working quickly, she jammed the tool into the valve stems of all 4 tires, deflating them one by one. Each hiss of escaping air was muffled by the truck's body, the sound swallowed by the desert wind. Dr. Lowe covered her from a distance, keeping an eye out for anyone who might notice her sabotage. When she returned, he gave a small nod of approval. Inside, Jenkins and Dr. Thomas had neutralized 2 more cartel members, stripping them of their weapons and rendering them unconscious. By the time the leader noticed the thinning ranks, his fury was written all over his face. "What the hell is happening here?" he shouted, reaching for his weapon. Clayton stepped forward, deliberately drawing the leader's attention. "Looks like you guys are having a bad day," he said with a smirk. his hand hovering near his belt, but not drawing his weapon. When the leader turned, Jenkins emerged from the shadows, his pistol aimed directly at the leader's head. "Drop it," Jenkins said coolly. "And I wouldn't try anything stupid. We've already disabled your ride." The leader's eyes darted to the truck parked outside. He couldn't see the flattened tires, but the confidence in Jenkins' voice made him hesitate. He snarled, reluctantly tossing his weapon to the ground. Dr. Thomas quickly scooped up the discarded firearm, unloading it and adding it to the growing pile of confiscated weapons. The cartel leader growled in frustration, raising his hands in surrender. "You think this ends here?" he spat. Jenkins didn't flinch, keeping the pistol trained on the man. "It ends for you. Walk away now and don't come back." The leader sneered but backed toward the door, motioning for his remaining conscious man to follow. Once the door slammed shut, Jenkins exhaled, his posture relaxing slightly. He turned to Dr. Harris. "Nice work on the truck." "Thanks," she replied, brushing dust off her knees. Eduardo stared at the pile of confiscated weapons, his face a mix of awe and terror. "You didn't kill them," he murmured. "Wasn't necessary," Jenkins replied simply, handing Eduardo one of the pistols. "But if they come back, you might need this." With the cartel members neutralized and their weapons confiscated, Eduardo's nerves began to settle, though his eyes frequently darted toward the door. His wife emerged from the back room, clutching their son tightly. The boy's bright, inquisitive eyes lingered on Dr. Thomas, who couldn't hide his fascination. Clayton broke the silence, resting a hand on Eduardo's shoulder. "We need your help, Eduardo. Something critical of ours is broken, and we can't fix it without the right equipment." Eduardo glanced uneasily toward the still disabled truck outside. "What do you mean by broken? What is it?" Dr. Harris stepped forward, holding the malfunctioning belt. "This," she said, her tone measured but urgent. "It's specialized technology, essential to us getting home. Right now, it's not working and we're stuck here." Eduardo studied the device, his brow furrowing. "I can fix a lot of things, but I don't recognize this. It's way beyond me." "Maybe not you," Dr. Harris said. Eduardo hesitated, running a hand over his face. "My cousin Javier, yes, he's an electrical engineer. He might be able to help, but the town is under cartel control. They're always watching. It's dangerous." Jenkins stepped in, his voice firm but understanding. "We can handle danger. We just need you to get us to him." Eduardo looked toward his wife, who nodded reluctantly. "Okay," he said at last, "but we have to be careful. If the cartel sees you with us, they'll start asking questions." Clayton nodded. "Understood. Jenkins, you and Dr. Thomas keep an eye out for trouble. Dr. Harris and Dr. Lowe, stay close to Eduardo and his family." He paused, then added with a faint smirk. "And no more fights unless absolutely necessary." Dr. Lowe quipped, "I'd prefer not to fight at all. My ribs are still sore from the landing." As they prepared to leave, Eduardo retrieved an old, battered pickup truck from behind the house. The vehicle was held together by duct tape and hope, but it would serve. His son stared curiously at the strangers, especially Dr. Thomas, who crouched to meet his gaze. "You're very strong," Dr. Thomas said softly, noting the boy's muscular build and jaguar-like reflexes as he dashed to retrieve a ball. "Remarkable." Eduardo's wife placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's healthy now, thanks to the serum." Dr. Thomas's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing, his mind already racing. The ride to town was tense. Eduardo drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he scanned the horizon for trouble. His wife sat beside him, cradling their son, while the team crowded into the truck bed. Jenkins kept his rifle hidden, but ready, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of cartel patrols. Eduardo broke the silence. "This belt of yours, it looks like nothing I've seen before. What does it do?" Dr. Harris hesitated, then decided honesty was the best route. "It's part of a larger system that allows us to travel far. When it malfunctions, we can't control where we end up or how we get back." Eduardo raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Javier might be able to help. If he can't, no one in town can." Log update. We've made contact. Found a family living in a remote house in the desert. Good people, but terrified. Turns out, the cartel has a strong presence in the area, and they're not exactly known for their hospitality. The father, Eduardo, agreed to help us. He's taken us to his cousin, an engineer, who might be able to fix the belt, but there's tension in the air. Every passing car, every shadow on the horizon. It's like everyone here is holding their breath, waiting for the cartel to show up. Speaking of tension, Jenkins is in his element. He got his eyes on everything, and I can see his mind working through contingencies. The man's a walking manual on tactical advantage. If trouble finds us, I'm confident he'll be ready. And then there's the boy, Eduardo's son. He's young, probably no more than 5, but different. Stronger, faster, more coordinated than any kid his age has the right to be. He had muscular dystrophy. With the serum, it's the first time we've seen it do something good. We're heading into town now. If the cartel doesn't give us trouble, maybe we can get the belt fixed and figure out our next move. If they do, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. As they approached the outskirts of the small desert town, Eduardo's nervousness became more palpable. A group of cartel enforcers loitered near a gas station, their sharp gazes sweeping over the road. Eduardo took a deep breath and slowed the truck to a crawl. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. Clayton leaned towards Jenkins. "Keep an eye on those guys, just in case." Jenkins gave a subtle nod, his hand resting on his holster as Eduardo rolled down the window to exchange a few terse words with the cartel men in Spanish. After an agonizing pause, they waved him through. "This is it," Eduardo said, pulling into a gravel driveway outside a modest house with a corrugated metal roof. The yard was cluttered with old appliances and spare parts. A satellite dish, looking jerry-rigged at best, perched precariously on one corner of the roof. The door opened before Eduardo could knock, revealing a wiry man with sharp eyes and greasy-stained hair. "Javier!" Eduardo began in Spanish, his voice tight with urgency. "These are guests. They need your help." Javier's gaze shifted to the team, then the belt Eduardo held in his hand. "What is this?" he asked in Spanish. Eduardo explained quickly, and Javier nodded, gesturing them inside. The interior of the house was a mix of a living space and a workshop. Circuit boards, tools, and half-assembled devices were scattered across every surface. "This is Javier," Eduardo introduced, switching to English for the team. "My cousin. He's an engineer." Javier glanced at Eduardo, then spoke rapidly in Spanish. Eduardo nodded and turned back to the group. "He says he'll look at it, but no promises. He'd like to know what exactly is this thing." Dr. Harris stepped forward. "It's a highly specialized piece of equipment. We use it for field research. Something in the energy transfer system got scrambled when we arrived. It's delicate work, but if you have the tools..." Javier snorted. "I have the tools. Let me see." He took the belt, examining it with sharp, practiced eyes. Eduardo moved to help, setting up a lamp for better light. "Javier's good," he said to Clayton. "If anyone can fix it, it's him." "Good to know," Clayton replied, his voice calm but watchful. For the next few hours, the room buzzed with focused energy. Dr. Harris, Javier, and Eduardo worked side by side, exchanging ideas in a mix of English and Spanish. Dr. Harris explained the technical intricacies of the belt, while Javier and Eduardo offered creative solutions to bypass the damaged components. At one point, Javier pulled a small soldering iron from his workbench. "This will take precision," he said, his Spanish rapid but clear. Dr. Harris nodded in agreement. "Careful with the flux," Dr. Harris murmured, leaning over to watch Javier's work. "If that connection shorts, we'll have to start over." Javier smirked, his hands steady as he worked. "I've done trickier things," he said confidently. Clayton stood near the door, watching with quiet respect. "Looks like they're making progress," he said to Jenkins. "Yeah," Jenkins replied, glancing out the window. "Let's just hope we have time to finish this before anyone comes knocking." Javier wiped his forehead, smearing grease across his temple as he squinted at the belt laid out on his cluttered workbench. "This thing is way more complicated than anything I've seen," he muttered in Spanish. Dr. Harris nodded, leaning over with a screwdriver in hand. "It's not built for field repairs," she admitted. "We're improvising, which makes this a long shot. But if we can get it to restart the signal search..." Eduardo stood nearby, handing over tools when asked. His expression was tense, but he said nothing, glancing frequently toward the other room where Dr. Thomas had taken his son. Inside, Dr. Thomas crouched beside the boy, who was sketching a jaguar with surprising precision. "That's impressive," he said with genuine admiration. The boy looked up, his golden yellow eyes meeting Dr. Thomas's. "Gracias," he murmured, his voice soft but confident. "You're quite the artist," Dr. Thomas continued, his gaze shifting to the boy's hand. They bore faint traces of claws at the tips of his fingers, and his posture suggested a level of flexibility most children couldn't achieve. Dr. Thomas's curiosity was piqued. "Do you feel stronger now?" he asked, gesturing to the boy's arms. The boy nodded, flexing his fingers. "See, my legs too," he said in Spanish, his face lighting up with pride. "I can run fast, like a jaguar." Dr. Thomas smiled warmly, hiding his growing unease. The serum worked, but at what cost? Meanwhile, in the workshop, Dr. Harris and Javier debated over wiring configurations, while Eduardo held a makeshift lamp steady. "The power core's calibration is off," Dr. Harris explained, tracing a line with her finger. "If we bypass this circuit..." Javier nodded, grabbing a roll of duct tape. "They'll stabilize it, but it won't hold forever." "Doesn't need to," Dr. Harris replied. "Just long enough for us to get out of here." Finally, after hours of work, Dr. Harris snapped the cover back onto the belt with a satisfying click. "All right, it's as patched up as it's gonna get." Clayton, who had been watching from the corner, stepped forward. "Does it work?" Dr. Harris hesitated. "We'll have to test it. No guarantees." Clayton raised an eyebrow. Comforting. Dr. Harris pressed a button on the belt. A faint hum emanated as the device powered up. The lights on its interface blinked erratically before settling into a slow, steady pattern. "It's scanning," she said. A faint beep sounded, followed by a static-laced whine. She leaned closer, her brow furrowing. "Did you hear that?" "Nope," Jenkins said flatly, arms crossed. "Just sounded like the usual to me," Dr. Lowe added. Dr. Harris shook her head, muttering, "It's faint, but there's interference. Could mean it's locking onto something." "Better than nothing," Clayton said, picking up the belt. He strapped it around his waist, adjusting to fit with practiced ease. "This isn't coming off again." Dr. Lowe smirked. Hope you're prepared for some awkward moments. Showering's about to get interesting. Clayton rolled his eyes, but couldn't suppress a small smile. Thanks for that image. Dr. Harris, still focused on the belt, muttered, We'll have to monitor the signal. If it doesn't stabilize, we'll need to recalibrate again. Clayton nodded, patting the device. And let's hope it holds. We can't afford to be stuck here. In the background, Eduardo poked his head in, his expression uneasy. Is it ready? Ready as it'll ever be, Dr. Harris replied, her voice edged with both hope and trepidation. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a fiery orange glow over the dusty town. Clayton adjusted the belt on his waist, its faint hum a constant reminder of their fragile situation. We need a way out, and fast, Jenkins muttered, scanning the perimeter of Javier's modest home. Cartels don't forgive, and they sure as hell don't forget. Eduardo stepped forward, wringing his hands nervously. There's someone who might help. Raul. He works for the cartel, but he hates them. He has a reason. Jenkins crossed his arms. And we're supposed to trust him? Clayton gave Eduardo a measured look. Why would he help us? Eduardo glanced back at his wife and son before lowering his voice. His brother. The cartel used a serum on him. It turned him into a monster. Raul wants revenge, but he can't do it alone. Great, Dr. Lowe muttered. A vengeful insider. What could possibly go wrong? Enough, Clayton said. We don't have options. Jenkins, take point. Make sure this meeting doesn't get us killed. The cantina reeked of stale beer and sweat. The team took positions around the dimly lit room, eyes scanning every shadow. Clayton leaned against the bar, his posture relaxed, but his hand close to his weapon. Raul arrived, his wiry frame wrapped in a threadbare jacket. His eyes darted nervously before settling on Eduardo. You shouldn't have come, he hissed in Spanish, his tone urgent. Eduardo responded, his words rapid and tense. Raul's expression shifted, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He says there's a shipment of serum coming tomorrow night, Dr. Thomas translated. The cartel plans to use it to create their own hybrid enforcers. He wants to stop it. Raul switched to broken English. Cartel, bad men, hurt people. I help you if you help stop them. Jenkins stepped forward, his gaze sharp. What do you have in mind? Raul pulled out a crumpled map, spreading it on the bar. He pointed to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The shipment comes here. We can take it, but after that, the people need to fight. Eduardo nodded. The townspeople, they've suffered enough. If we give them the serum, they'll fight back. Dr. Harris frowned. We're talking about turning civilians into hybrids. That's not a small decision. Raul's gaze hardened. Better than being slaves to the cartel. Clayton looked at the map, then at his team. We'll help, but no mistakes. Jenkins, coordinate the operation. Raul, you're our guide. Dr. Harris, Dr. Lowe, get the belt ready in case we need to bail. The next day passed in tense preparation. Raul and Jenkins planned the raid, their quiet intensity contagious. Eduardo and Dr. Thomas spread the word, their quiet urgency igniting a spark in the weary townspeople. As night fell, the small town came alive with muted whispers and covert movements. People sharpened tools, hid weapons, and whispered prayers. Eduardo's son watched from a corner, his jaguar-like eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Clayton stood with Jenkins, watching the preparations. This is going to get messy. Jenkins smirked. That's the best kind of fight. The air was thick with tension as the team gathered near the outskirts of the warehouse. Clayton shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the belt as Dr. Harris and Dr. Lowe crouched beside him, tools in hand. "I've had to deal with worse field repairs," Dr. Lowe muttered, examining the belt's circuitry. "Though this might be the first time I've knelt at a guy's waist in a desert. Usually, there's at least a dinner first." Clayton cracked a nervous grin, trying to mask his unease. "I'll put in the reservations as soon as we're back. You two can argue over who gets dessert." "Focus," Dr. Harris snapped, her voice clipped. She adjusted her glasses and poked at the belt with a small probe. "This thing's barely holding together." Clayton's expression softened. "Then we improvise. We always do, right?" Dr. Lowe chuckled. "That's your plan? Hope and duct tape?" "It hasn't failed us yet," Clayton replied, his smile fading slightly. From their vantage point, Raoul and Jenkins watched the convoy roll into the warehouse yard. The trucks were unmarked, their cargo hidden beneath canvas tarps. A handful of guards armed with automatic rifles hopped down, scanning the area. "They're light tonight," Jenkins observed, lowering his binoculars. "We've got a shot." Raoul nodded, his face grim. "They won't expect us, but we must move fast." Jenkins signaled for the group to gather, his voice low and steady. "All right, here's the play. Raoul and I will handle the guards. Eduardo and Javier, you're our backup. Dr. Harris, stay with Dr. Lowe and Clayton. Make sure that belt is ready." Clayton raised an eyebrow. "You sure you don't want me out front? You know, being the leader and all." "Not this time, Chief," Jenkins said with a small smirk. "You're better at keeping things together than breaking them apart." Clayton rolled his eyes but nodded. "Fine, just don't get us killed." The group moved silently toward the warehouse, shadows dancing in the dim moonlight. Jenkins gestured for Raoul to take the far side, signaling for Eduardo and Javier to follow his lead. With swift efficiency, Jenkins incapacitated the first guard, his movements a blur. Eduardo, nerves steeled by desperation, followed suit, wielding a makeshift weapon to knock another guard unconscious. Javier watched, his heart pounding as he kept his weapon trained. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Not bad for amateurs," he muttered under his breath as Eduardo glanced back with a nervous grin. Meanwhile, Raoul slipped into the warehouse, his familiarity with the layout guiding them to the shipment. He radioed back in Spanish, his voice tense with determination. Dr. Thomas translated quickly. "He's got the serum. Says there's enough for everyone." As the group began loading the serum into a waiting truck, a sharp crack broke the silence. A spotlight snapped on, bathing the yard in harsh light. "Stop right there!" A voice barked in Spanish from the shadows, followed by a distinct sound of weapons being cocked. "Not good," Jenkins muttered, stepping in front of Eduardo. Javier's voice wavered slightly as he called out, "We don't want trouble! Just let us go and no one gets hurt!" The reply came in the form of gunfire, bullets kicking up dust around their feet. Raoul cursed under his breath, drawing his weapon. "Time to move!" Jenkins barked. "Everyone, cover each other!" With coordinated precision, the group retreated, using the truck as cover. Eduardo's hand shook as he clutched the wheel, waiting for the signal to drive. Jenkins fired a few shots over the hood. Dr. Lowe shouted and pointed. "Clayton, the belt! It's picking up a strong signal!" Dr. Harris followed up. "It's stabilizing!" "Perfect timing!" Clayton yelled back. Jenkins climbed into the truck bed, hauling the last of the serum crates aboard. "Eduardo! Javier! Move! Now!" The engine roared to life, and the truck peeled out, leaving a trail of dust and chaos behind. As the truck rumbled down a dirt road, the team took a collective breath. Dr. Thomas checked the serum crates, his eyes wide with fascination. "This stuff, it's going to change everything," he muttered. Clayton leaned back against the truck's cab, the belt humming faintly at his waist. "Let's hope it changes things for the better," he said softly, his fingers brushing over the controls. Dr. Lowe nudged him with a grin. "You know, if this works, I'm taking all the credit." "Sure," Clayton replied, smiling faintly. "But only if we make it out alive." The night was alive with tension, the warehouse raid a blur behind them. The truck rattled into the center of town. Raul directed Eduardo to stop near the plaza. The team disembarked, unloading the crates of serum as quietly as possible. Shadows moved in the alleys. Townsfolk, who had been waiting for this moment, their shadows moving quick under the moonlight. Log update. This might be the most reckless thing I've ever agreed to, and that's saying a lot. The townsfolk are restless, desperate. They've been living under the cartel's boot for so long that the idea of fighting back feels like a fairy tale. But now, with these serums, everything's changed. Eduardo's taken a huge risk distributing them. His son's proof the stuff works, but it's a double-edged sword. We've seen what happens when the serum goes wrong. Hybrids can lose control, become monsters. It's a gamble, one Eduardo seems willing to take for the sake of his people. Jenkins is preparing the townsfolk, running them through the plan like it's a covert op. Dr. Lowe and Dr. Harris have been working on the belt calculations non-stop, and I'm praying to anyone listening that it holds up. If we can't use it, we're stuck here, and I don't want everyone to get snapped back into random places. Dr. Lowe told us what the best case scenario of that looks like. This isn't our fight, but I can't just stand by and do nothing. These people deserve a chance, and if we can give it to them, even just for one night, then maybe all of this is worth it. Still, I can't shake the feeling that this is going to get ugly. Desperation and power make for a volatile mix. Raul turned to Clayton, his voice steady. "This is where we make our stand. We've waited long enough." Clayton hesitated, glancing at the belt still humming faintly at his waist. "You're sure about this? We don't know what kind of chaos this could bring." Raul met his gaze. "The chaos has been here for years. Tonight, we fight back." The crates were pried open, the glass vials catching the light as they were passed from hand to hand. Some took the serum with trembling fingers, others with resolute determination. Eduardo hesitated, his eyes darting to Raul. "For my son," he whispered, his hand closing around a vial. Dr. Thomas stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "Eduardo, are you sure? There's no going back." Eduardo nodded, determination hardening his features. "If it means protecting him, I'll do it." Without another word, he injected the serum into his arm. The transformation was swift, his body convulsing before settling into something stronger, sharper. His eyes gleamed with a predatory intensity, and his breathing steadied as his muscles rippled with newfound power. Raul clapped him on the shoulder with a strong assurance. The first shots rang out from the edge of town. The cartel had arrived, their trucks kicking up dust as they barreled into the plaza. Townsfolk scattered into the shadows, their hybrid forms blending seamlessly into the darkness. Clayton watched from the plaza's center, his team crouched behind the truck. "Jenkins, take point. Raul, get your people ready. This is it." Jenkins nodded, his rifle at the ready. "We hold them here." The hybrids moved with eerie precision, their enhanced abilities giving them the upper hand. Some scaled buildings, ambushing cartel members from above. Others darted between shadows, taking out enemies with silent efficiency. Dr. Harris and Dr. Lowe stayed close to the truck. Dr. Lowe muttered, "Remind me to write a paper on this when we're back." In the chaos, the belt at Clayton's waist began to beep with increasing intensity. Dr. Harris's eyes lit up as she noticed the faint signal strengthening. "Clayton!" she called, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. "The portal! It's close! It's stabilizing!" Clayton ducked as a bullet ricocheted off the truck. "Where?" Dr. Harris checked her pad, then pointed toward the heart of town, her gaze locking on the old church bell tower. "There! It's coming from there!" Raoul overheard, his eyes narrowing.
"We'll get you there. The townsfolk will cover you."
Raoul rallied the hybrids, their feral strength and determination driving the cartel forces back. Eduardo, now fully adapted to his new abilities, took the lead, his movements swift and calculated.
"Clayton, go!"
Raoul shouted.
"We'll hold them off."
The team moved as one, Clayton leading the charge with Jenkins covering the rear. Eduardo and Raoul flanked them, their hybrid forms a blur as they took down the remaining cartel guards in their path. The bell tower loomed ahead, its silhouette sharp against the night sky. The belt beat faster, its signal clear and unwavering. "We're close!" Dr. Harris yelled, her voice tinged with urgency. As the team reached the church steps, the hybrids formed a protective circle around them. The townsfolk, now fully united, roared with newfound strength, driving the cartel into full retreat. Clayton turned to Eduardo, his voice steady. "Are you sure about this? You'll be putting a target on your back." Eduardo nodded, his gaze firm.
"For my son. For all of us."
Clayton placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you. We won't forget this." As the portal's energy began to ripple through the air, Eduardo stepped back, his hybrid form glowing faintly in the moonlight.
"Go,"
he said, his voice resolute.
"We'll keep it safe."
The portal shimmered to life, its energy pulling the team forward. Clayton hesitated for a brief moment, taking in the chaos and courage of the townsfolk behind him. "Let's move!" he finally shouted, leading the team into the staticky vortex. As the portal closed, the hybrids stood victorious. Their roars echoed into the night. The town had changed forever, its people no longer victims, but defenders of their own fate. The swirling static of the portal gave way to a dizzying black void. Gravity seemed to reverse for a heartbeat before slamming them back down into reality. Crash! Clayton hit the surface of a cafeteria table with a grunt, scattering trays, plates, and a small mountain of spaghetti. He blinked up at the fluorescent lights, trying to piece together what had just happened. Dr. Harris tumbled in next, landing ungracefully atop a pile of overturned chairs. "Ow!" she groaned. Jenkins arrived with a thud onto another table, knocking over a carefully arranged stack of sandwiches. As the cafeteria erupted into chaos, he dusted himself off and looked around. "CERN cafeteria," he muttered. "Close enough." Dr. Lowe and Dr. Thomas weren't far behind, both managing to land awkwardly but relatively intact amidst the growing crowd of stunned onlookers. Clayton pushed himself to a seated position, rubbing his head. "Seriously? We couldn't have landed somewhere quiet?" "Hey, at least no broken bones," Dr. Lowe quipped, crouching to check on the others. Jenkins smirked, surveying the startled scientists and workers who were now gawking at them. "Perfect landing if you ask me. I'm starving." The absurdity of the situation hit Clayton, and he couldn't help but let out a small laugh despite himself. "Great," Dr. Harris muttered, picking bits of mashed potatoes off her sleeve. "Now we're the lunch special." The yellow doors of the portal room swung open, revealing the team, disheveled and weary, but very much alive. Dr. Chang looked up from her workstation, her mouth falling open in shock as Clayton, Jenkins, Dr. Harris, Dr. Lowe, and Dr. Thomas filed in. "You're alive!" she gasped, standing abruptly. "How? What? Where? Clayton didn't wait for her to finish. He reached down, unfastened the malfunctioning belt, and held it out. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and dry humor. This thing needs upgrades. Preferably something bulletproof next time, he said with a smirk. Dr. Chang blinked, then accepted the belt with a hesitant nod. I don't even know where to begin. The data indicated you were... Dead? Jenkins interjected, plopping onto a nearby chair. Close enough. The group chuckled softly, tension draining from their faces as the realization of their survival settled in. Dr. Chang stared at the belt, clearly calculating everything she wanted to say, but couldn't articulate yet. As the debriefing commenced, the team recounted their journey. The Philadelphia hybrid gangs, the crash landing, the cartel threats, Eduardo's family, the townsfolk's rebellion, and their chaotic escape. Dr. Chang listened intently, her fingers steepled as her sharp eyes scanned each of them. Jenkins continued by gesturing to Dr. Harris's jacket pocket. Care to explain, Doc? Dr. Harris smiled faintly, her tone even as she pulled out the same card she used at the police station. It's a Vatican diplomat card. Since I was recruited to this program, I started to carry it, just in case. A Vatican card? Dr. Chang echoed, clearly impressed. How did you even get... It's a long story, Dr. Harris replied. Well, it worked, Jenkins said with a shrug. Saved us a lot of headaches. Dr. Chang leaned back, her gaze sharp. So, first Philadelphia with the gangs, then Mexico, and now this rebellion. You all saw both sides of this serum's influence. Jenkins chuckled, shaking his head. Philly was bad, but nothing like the cartels. It felt good to put the serum in the right hands to release them from that tyranny. Clayton crossed his arms. Philadelphia feels like a blur now. From gangs trying to steal serum shipments, dealing with the police station, and then the belt malfunctioning leading us to that crazy romp through Mexico. Dr. Chang nodded. The serum spread in the States caused enough chaos. I can't imagine what it would have done if the cartels had gotten their hands on it. Which they didn't, thanks to Eduardo's family, Dr. Thomas added. And us, Jenkins said with a smirk. The debriefing wrapped up, and as the team began to disperse, Jenkins caught up with Clayton near the hallway. You know, Jenkins started, arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. You're not half bad at this leadership thing. Clayton quirked a brow. Not bad? That's a glowing praise coming from you. I mean it, Jenkins said with a small grin. You kept your head, made the right calls, and, most importantly, you trusted me to do my job. It worked. Clayton nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. You've got a knack for taking chaos and turning it into something resembling a plan. Couldn't have done it without you. Damn right, Jenkins replied with a mock salute. As they walked off, the faint echoes of laughter and camaraderie filled the underground halls of CERN. The mission had been a wild, unpredictable ride, but they had made it back, and that's what mattered. Portal Entry Report, Dr. Emily Chang. World Designation, Hybrid World. Portal Frequency, 591 Hz. Classification, Zone Yellow. Dangerous hybrids and serum power struggles. Assessment, mark as Level 6 restricted frequency. Request suppression of any and all knowledge of serum for safety concerns. Special note, reinforcing belt to withstand battlefield conditions. Considering upgrades and creation of a second belt for backup purposes. Power itself is neither good nor evil. It becomes what the hands that hold it make of it. In the wrong hands, it corrupts and destroys. But in the right hands, it heals and inspires. The truest measure of power lies not in its possession, but in the choices it inspires and the principles that guide them. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening. And thank you for being patient with my bad accents. I know that's one thing I definitely need to practice when I'm doing my voiceover. But this was a good story. I wanted part 2 to be more of a message of hope and what good can be done with the serum. Part 1 was about the chaos and madness that the serum can cause in like a big city. But when people are desperate and they need some kind of hope, that's what part 2 was all about. That's why the name is Hybrid Revolution. This time I'm not going to talk so much about the AI because it was pretty much a 50-50 of crafting the story and then me having to go through and edit and change a lot of things. So now time for the plugs. I am on Rumble as well as YouTube, so you can find me on both. And I do have a Buy Me a Coffee link if you feel generous and want to donate to my creative process. And as always, remember, it's okay to be scared. I am too. Embrace the strange, embrace creativity, embrace the story and adventure of things, and I'll see you later.